of Gadsden Creek and what is West Edge seeking to fill and subsequently develop? And the answer, it's about 4 acres of what DHEC refers to as critical zone, which is anything really below the high water mark. So that's the marsh grass you see there. That's the actual creek, which we'll be able to see far better once we get closer to the creek. But it's 4 acres of critical fish habitat, of habitat where you see blue crabs, you see fiddler crabs, you see oysters, you see all sorts of fish and shorebirds. And the only thing standing between West Edge and the community, our community, is Gadsden Creek. So it's a bit of a buffer. So the place where I like to start the tour, well, I guess first I'll introduce myself while Mika is handing out some flyers. So that one there. So I like to start the tour by centering us in history. And what I want us to do is we only have 4 of these, so you guys are going to have to share. But yeah, look with your neighbors, and the first thing that we're going to do is step into a time machine and go all the way back to 1934. The reason why we chose 1934 is because that's the image that you see in your hands right there. And I want you guys, for those of you who've never seen that image, I guarantee that you've seen something that's in that image, which is this area, which is gray on the paper, but it's green. That's Harmon Field, where we are right there. So knowing that that's Harmon Field, I want you guys to try to figure out where we are today if you were to drop yourself down onto that map in 1934. So take a look at some of the streets, take a look at maybe everything else other than Harmon Field might look a little different, but the streets are the same. So maybe try looking at some of the streets. Another key, I'll give you guys a clue. This is Burke, right up there. So, yeah, this is Burke right there. So this baseball diamond is going to be that corner of Harmon Field over there. So now that you know that, where do you think we're standing right now? Right about right there. Wow. So we're basically standing in the creek. If we transported ourselves to 1934,
we'd be in the creek.
We'd be in the creek. And you know what? We are in the creek. If we look, we see this plant. I didn't mean to pull it up. I shouldn't have done that, but I'll plant it again. This is called sea beans or sea pickles.
Can you eat them?
You can eat them, yeah. It's another species of marsh. So this is going to be called sea oxeye. So all these plants that we're seeing here, this is telling us that this is a marsh system here, which tells us that there's water. There's tidal water somewhere around here, and where that tidal water is.
That means when it floods, that means the water come up that high as that plant? Okay.
Yeah. So we're standing where the water used to be, this big old creek. If anyone's seen Shem Creek, or if anyone's been out to some of the sea islands and seen any of these big creek systems, Gadsden Creek used to be about the same size, a pretty large system.
I'm Mary Coster, and I'm a science teacher. I met some of you guys. And one of the things that we do as scientists is we ask for evidence to support claims. And so the developers made the claim that this isn't even a creek, it's a ditch. And so if it's not a creek, why are we finding all the plants and animals that you would associate with a creek in the creek? One of the things that the students ask me all the time, look at that, marsh grass is growing up on both sides of Haygood. That only happens when it's a creek.
And we're in 1934 right there. We're going to go back a few more years to 1931. So if you guys all have, there should be two, and then yeah, that's perfect. And then, so this is 1931.
I want to hold this.
This is a visualization that the city of Charleston put together in 1931 that shows the population distribution of this area. So here's Gadsden Creek right there. We've got Gadsden Creek coming in here. This is the Ashley River. This is Spring Street, so just over there. And then right here, this is President. So Harmon Field is kind of this area where we were just standing. So here we are again in the creek, right? 1931. The interesting thing about this is in this time, when the city was making this map, what they wanted to show is what does the population of this part of the peninsula look like. And they showed the different population distribution using either a black dot, which represented 10 African American residents, or a white dot, which represented 10 Caucasian residents. And you can see that up against the creekfront property, it was an nearly exclusively African American community. And in that same report, I'll hand that back. So, and then here is the city's, so this was the first map, was what the population was at that time.
They look identical,
The
but they're
next,
different.
the next map is the desired population
Oh, you can tell.
for what the future,
Tell.
what they want that to be.
Desired, they wanted.
And where's Gadsden Creek? What's on top of Gadsden Creek now?
White dots.
White dots,
This is
right?
good find, Cyrus.
Yeah, this is deep digging in the archives.
This is crazy.
And so what we see there is beginning in 1931, the city envisioned Gadsden Creek going away. The city envisioned all this marsh that the Gadsden Green community lived right next to going away. And in its place, what did they see? They saw larger spaced out white dots. So that means larger properties, wealthier properties for white residents. And this plan was set in place in 1931, and everything that transpired decades following to today
Yes.
is a function of this initial vision that was established in 1931.
And what I heard just now was the term gentrification, which is pretty much the more general, largely held phrase. But there's other phrases too. Amber, you probably can help me out as well. But plan shrinkage is another term. Did we hear any other phrase when plan shrinkage
urban
or
renewal.
Urban renewal.
Yeah, yeah.
That's what I was thinking. And other signifiers, which generally kind of mean the same, some of the same things. Yeah.
They want to push us to the rural areas and make the suburbs.
But not only that, they created more real estate with the dump first. So first they had to visit the harm of environmental racism upon the people, and then creating more real estate, and then that's
Exactly. No, that's exactly right. I mean, to Tamika's point, the only way that this vision, this second slide of the future population distribution could become a reality is how?
to remove the people that
Well,
were there.
to remove that and also to fill in what? Because
The creek.
the creek, to fill in the creek, to fill in the wetlands, and there was about, at that time, 100 acres. John was asking earlier how many acres remain? 4. So you can see how successful, they've
96
been.
acres?
96 acres. So they've been 96% successful in their vision that was outlined in 1931 to fill in all of this natural resource that belongs to the people in order to create space for a certain segment of the people. And
Joe Riley, like, didn't take office long after 1931. And he just got out of office not too long ago and
Following the
just
tradition.
passed the baton.
Follow
Like,
the tradition of Maybank, of Lockwood, a number of other mayors.
to echo this, this was, and I'm fast forwarding a little bit, but just this is a good prompt here. Beginning in the 1950s, so 1931, they didn't get going with this vision right away. We had the Depression, then the U.S. got into World War II, so there were some disruptions to kind of city's progress, but eventually by 1950, the wheels of progress were really cranking again. And this is from an engineering report from the 1950s saying, quote, when the marsh area, this is a city engineering report, quote, when the marsh area in the vicinity of Fishburne Street are developed for building lots, a sewer pumping station will be required. Basically acknowledging that if we fill in all of this land, exactly, yeah, we need, something's gonna happen, we need to do something with all the water, and that never
they're
happened.
not fixing it now. No, they're not fixing it now. But after they build things up, they're going to put something in place to
Well, they already
prevent
heard.
that from happening. Wow.
Exactly.
over there,
With that
but
retaining
not over here. It's
Yeah.
like the flooding's not going to happen over there because of who's over here. But we want to flood these people out. Just like how they did with the aquarium. They told them the land was contaminated. After they moved them out, shut it down, built the aquarium and so many other things on Calvary Street.
That's a drive.
And this is another quote from the mayor of Charleston in 1956 as part of their, quote, land reclamation program.
That's another phrase.
Land reclamation. All of you, I am sure, are aware of the splendid progress being made with the city's land filling program in the vicinity of the Johnson-Hagan Municipal Stadium. It is easy to envision the handsome municipal development which can take place in this area. 1957. The city has, during the present administration, created at the foot of Fishburne Street 22 acres of land. A reliable and independent appraisal has been made of the value of these 22 acres, and certificate states that this 22 acres is conservatively appraised at $25,000 an acre, or a total of $550,000, well in excess of $500,000 already in liquid asset.
And that's in 1957.
1957, and then the final kind of quote from the city, 1958. Every year, if you look back at that first slide that Mika showed you, the 1934 visual, every year the city was filling in about 25 acres of marsh a year, roughly, with some years being more quote, successful than others. In 1951, 1958, they say, quote, we are reclaiming, from who, right? We are reclaiming more than 100 acres of marshland in the area between Spring Street and the Citadel on the Ashley waterfront. Numerous suggestions have been made as to the uses to which these properties should be put. The city engineer this morning furnished me with an estimate of the amount of new land in the stadium area, and there he finds that approximately 25 acres have been created. A minimum value of $33,000 per acre. That means that the city of Charleston has, as I've expressed before, cash in the bank. We are now producing through landfilling development an average of 15 plus acres per year. When converted into cash, means $500,000 per year in city assets, which, as I have said before, and I say again, is cash in the bank. That
So
was
you just said 33,000 for just one building, right?
one
One
acre.
acre.
One acre.
Yeah.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
When they were making this plan, was the law already in place, like the buildings couldn't be higher than the church steeple, or this came after that?
That's a good question. I don't.
That's more so
Great
peninsula. Isn't
Yeah.
that more like the peninsula?
Well,
type?
that's a good question. There were laws to prevent, and I don't know about height at that time. There certainly were laws to prevent what the city was doing, and I'll get to that a little bit further down. But everything the city was doing was illegal. You know, it was illegal.
Illegal with the
Rivers and Harbors Act, which prevented the filling of wetlands, the filling of navigable waters, which Gadsden Creek was and still is. A few of us have paddled it several times, a navigable water. And so when we look here, and we're at low tide, the headwaters of Gadsden Creek today, it's changed every single year, every single minute. All creeks, all waterways are dynamic. Begins at the intersection, kind of the stoplights up there. And it begins trickling its way downstream here. And then every part, like a road or a culvert, drainage culvert, is one form of choking. So the creek is being choked off in this area. It's being forced into that culvert, which means all the life that is coming in and out of the creek is also being choked by these culverts. But it makes its way resiliently underground here and over here, and we can see it open back up there.
No, so he's gonna tell you why that's a real. She just talked about the contours.
Oh yeah.
Talk about that.
So watch this car when they drive by. Watch them walk. Ready? And the reason they do that is the creek is still here. There just happens to be a road on top of it, and all the soils are still here. There just happens to be trash and
That's why the ground.
and
So regardless
foundation.
if they like fix it or not, it's going to crack again.
Right,
Yeah.
trash on top of a creek. Yeah,
Oh.
So
It's gonna always, and the creek is always gonna come back home. You know what I'm saying?
and
It's like mold. It don't
and-
have no,
Yeah.
no boundaries of where it can go. It's coming.
exactly right.
Sunny day flooding, exactly that. Titles.
So the sunny day, flooding has been compounded by impervious development, buildings, and even impervious surfaces like all this packed soil over here. The water has nowhere to go, and so you couple that with tidal flow, port, engineering, etc., and the water is going to go to the path of least resistance. And unfortunately, both the city has treated parts of the community because they deem it to be the path of least resistance, right? So where the water goes is also where the city sees there being a path of least resistance.
Can I chime in again?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so one of the things that has been established over history, and especially by anthropologists, is that as long as we remain illiterate of these cause and effect relationships, this kind of development can happen right under our noses. So it's seriously important that we become literate about these issues and use our voices to speak truth to it. Otherwise, nothing changes if nothing changes. So that would be my 2 cents worth.
Very, very true. Mika's going to hand back out that 1934 slide just so we center ourselves again and kind of what everything looked like, and if you can imagine yourselves like what the creek was doing at that time. And this is important because that report from 1931, right? It took, the 50s or so before they could really start filling in this land. But one of the early actions to see this vision to reality was in 1939, 1938, after a set of tornadoes sweep through 1938, sweep through the peninsula. And the tornadoes had devastating impact on the Market Street area, Broad Street area, loss of life, loss of property, and the same thing up here through Gadsden Green, or what was also referred to as Fiddler's Green. And unfortunately, what the city did is they seized on that opportunity less than a month after many of the buildings were damaged, and they made a decision to condemn the entire. So all of this area is, if you can see, these are individual homes, right? Creekfront homes right along Harmon Field. This is President Street.
This is a picture of the typical
All of
damage
this,
that would have occurred. In
some of these buildings were damaged, and so the city seized on that opportunity, and they decided we are going to condemn through eminent domain this entire Gadsden Green community.
So yeah, and I think this is important to highlight, because I'm hearing it in conversation, highlight the parallels between other disasters that we've seen, like a Katrina, like a Hugo, and then what kind of activity you see following these horrific natural disasters. You get, of course, disaster capitalism, but I don't even know what the phrase is for like disaster development.
Yeah.
I don't know what a phrase is for that.
called urban renewal.
But in terms of like specifically like disaster capitalism, it's a land grab.
Yeah.
Right, and some of the
People can't afford to fix it, so let's just go ahead and take
but
it.
that's not actually, that's the narrative. That's the going to counter the narrative,
Yeah.
right? Because that's never really what really happens.
Right. So then hand out this. So tornadoes whip through the area, right? Passing over the creek, passing over the marsh, and eventually working their way into the Gadsden Green communities. And this would have been a community of small shops on the corner. This would have been a community of single family homes with, the typical Charleston single house. And the city took the opportunity to then say, well, we are going to take through eminent domain and through seizure all of this community from Allway to Line Street, which was called Chestnut, which is now Haggard, all the way to President. We're going to basically take that entire swath of neighborhood, and we're going to take all that private property from the community.
Okay, well tell me, that cannot happen today.
It can, yeah.
They actually you're seeing precursors to it now.
It's
happening now.
So take for example, what was it? The restaurant right here on East Bay Street. The older lady that's been there for
Martha
years.
Lou.
Yeah.
Martha Lou's. They had what's the word again? You just said it.
Eminent domain?
They pushed her out and said she had to go because they bought the land and her restaurant stood on the land, and that's today. Because they need to build up high rises and everything.
But more so in terms of like the other parallel was the borough home situation that you said over near the aquarium. So when my father used to live in those projects before they deemed the land too toxic. So they come up with some sort of justification. Here it was, this property is beyond repair. Though we have proof that the colored population, I'm only using that term, that colored population that was here was actually rebuilding their homes. Rebuilding their home. And I think we have to kind of like divorce ourselves from the pathology that like because you might be low income that you don't have the resources to resource yourself and rebuild. We see it. We see that more so that poor people and black people, people of color, are the ones that are usually more philanthropic, right? And through church or through whatever. And then we saw them banding together to rebuild their homes as a collective and raise money and have fairs and whatnot. So that's like that pathology. They tell us, well, they didn't have enough, they didn't have the resources. It's honestly not true.
But the land was private. It was their land.
Oh, they seized it.
Private owned. That's why it made me say, how can this happen?
And
It's an injustice.
That's the tragedy. And I went to the Registry of Deeds and I actually looked at the pages of conveyance, meaning the transfer of that private property to then the Housing Authority and the City of Charleston. 75 families lost their homes, which means they lost access to building generational wealth, to handing this most important asset from one generation to the next. from not being in this power dynamic
Because-
of renting from someone
Right,
else.
right.
Hurricane came through and damaged their home.
Right.
Tornado.
Yeah.
Tornado.
Hey, we're at like
They said that
22
we're
minutes,
gonna-
Cyrus, so we might want to move.
Sorry, John. And then what was
We're going to condemn the homes
Right.
because they're too badly damaged.
Well, and it was, you know, now that we found this 1931 vision, we realized that it's all kind of, it was all a part of this.
It was planned.
Because, you know, homes south of Broad, on Broad Street, you know, on
Yeah, they
East
were-
Bay,
they were
those were
hit
not,
too.
those were not condemned.
Yeah.
You know, they were not, they
Yeah.
were rebuilt, etc. And we found this letter from 1940, 2 years. Yeah, 2 years after the tornadoes swept through, and thinking that, you know, well, certainly there would be record of protest and record of opposition to private property being seized. And we found this record, and I didn't attach the second page, but the second page has about 40 signatures of Gadsden Green residents, and you can read, you know, that letter. The highlighted part is the most damning part of it, which, if anyone has it, if anyone would like to read it.
That this is the largest group of colored property owners in any single area in the city of Charleston. If we are forced to give up our homes at this time, it will be the greatest tragedy to befall and unfortunate people on unfortunate people.
Yeah, I mean that, you know, that is looking deep into the future of, you know, this will be
That's
devastating.
scary because it sounds like red all over it.
Yeah, and then too, like even if the properties are like private owned, if a developer has enough money to buy that property out and the proposal is really good to say, okay, this is fit for this area, it can happen.
Sure. Well, and you're absolutely right. And you know, the thing with this letter that was most compelling, you know, was the fact that history has recorded dissenting voices who have said, no, this isn't right. And what do we see if you look hard? Right on the background of Harmon Field, but we see a pile of trash, right? And so not only was the city benefiting from this pile of trash because they were creating real estate, but they were benefiting at the expense of the residents who had to live next to this trash. And it was not just trash for a year or 2 years, nearly 20 years worth of this kind of activity.
Open dump in
Open
your
dump.
in your backyard where there was a sprawling creek.
We've got old plats. We've been able to find the old plats that show the structure that once was here in this location, and that, you know, these bricks would have been the foundation of that.
And we
that
know
structure.
anecdotally from the people we've spoken to, people used to crab and fish out the window.
Right.
So people's homes are right up against the creeks at some point. Yeah.
So this was, before it became Haygood, was called Chestnut Street. If you look at the first slide that Mika handed out, this one,
Remember the
I'm going to just point right here.
Yeah.
This is what Haygood basically became, and it dead ends right into the creek. So if we were back in 1930s or so, even 1940s, even 1950s, because remember they started the landfill up on Fishburne, and it wasn't until close to the 70s that they made their way with all fill down here. This would have dead ended, and you would have seen a giant creek that Mika said you would have been able to crab in, you would have been able to swim in. And we found records from the 1870s where the city actually designated Gadsden Creek as a public swimming, they refer to it as a bathing place for youth. And you know, reading between the lines that it's specifically for Charleston's African American youth. And you know, the Post, I forget if it was News and Courier or whatever it was called at that time, made mention that there were, quote, complaints from children, from kids swimming in areas that were deemed undesirable for them to be bathing. And so the city designated certain areas to be. Now, in that time, 1870s, with Gadsden Creek, this beautiful landscape of uninterrupted Spartina and Tidal Creek, it was the industrial part of the city. It was called Butcher Town. And it was where the abattoirs, you know, the slaughterhouses were, because of the great might of the creek would be able to take all the refuse, you know, all the blood and guts from the butcher shop. Exactly. And then
It
you also,
would be wasted.
right. And you also had a sawmill up here at the same time. And so the history of Gadsden Creek is one where 1950s, 1960s, it's badly degraded, it's channelized, it's straightened, it's forced to go into a straight line, which is very unnatural for a creek to do. And eventually in the 1970s, early 1970s, the Department of Justice and the Army Corps of Engineers threatened legal action against the city of Charleston for violating what Mika said earlier, the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899, which made it illegal to fill in a resource like this. As part of this settlement, the city agreed to an after-the-fact permit, which basically said you have to keep any sort of trash from getting out of where it is, right? So you have to care and maintain the landfill. You also can't prevent the public from use of any waters, which would include Gadsden Creek. We are so detached from that 1972 settlement that the city, West Edge, other partners are now advocating to destroy what remains of those, what once was 100 acres of Tidal Creek. There's 4 acres remaining, and unfortunately for West Edge, they exist in a very strategic location between phase 1 of the development, and I'm sure they view this to be phase 2. And it's the only thing separating and serving as a buffer between West Edge and their encroachment on the rest of the community.
Okay, they don't have a dump anything, so it could be a little bit more expensive to cover this.
Well, that's their goal is that the value of
The land was worth what they put into
well worth it, and it's well worth the
$33,000 an acre is a lot of money.
exactly.
But talk about what West Edge already, how they already profited.
Right. Well, it's been 6 years of fighting. So the opposition to this plan has been in some form for 6 years now, and so it's well worth paying professionals and attorneys to do that because of the potential profit. The Caroline, the apartment right over there,
That's right over with the Domino's Pizza,
Yep.
right?
just sold for $77 million
Whoa.
to a
How much did it? Yep.
California-based
$77
million.
So they already started flipping. That's the plan. It's not to maintain this area. The plan is to build and to flip it into the hands of other.
Institutional investors, pension funds.
So it cost them $4 million. So I think approximately about $4 million to build the Caroline.
I don't
Well,
know.
that's what I saw.
Okay, yeah.
I might be
No.
off. But they made a huge profit.
Yeah.
And it sold for $77 million. How long
Yeah.
ago was it built?
They want to go in.
Like 2 years ago, maybe?
2 years ago?
So that's not only that, didn't they? So what about low income housing? Did they build in low income
Oh,
housing? What
great
happened with
point.
that?
So the city at that time, where phase 1 of West Edge, there was an opportunity referred to as the pay in lieu of program. So typically for this kind of zoning, there's a city requirement to actually put a certain percentage of affordable units in that housing. There is a clause, a bit of a kind of loophole within the statute, within the code, that said if you pay a fee into kind of the housing slush fund, then you don't need to put those units. So West Edge, rather than putting affordable units, paid the fee because it was cheaper to pay the fee, build market rate product, and then to sell.
So not even the ordinances that we have in place are protecting or guaranteeing that folks have livable, be able to live here.
To follow the extent of the creek all the way to the Ashley River.
You can still walk it.
This is,
John does it every day.
Yeah.
If you want to connect yourself to the Atlantic Ocean, this is your conduit. This is your bridge right here to the Ashley River. Every droplet of water that lands in Gadsden Creek seeks out that journey to the Atlantic Ocean.
Wow.
Because we're still connected, right?
Yeah.
So you wouldn't know it because there's overgrowth, there's buildings, there's stuff obstructing that connection, but the connection is still there. But what's being proposed is a complete severing of that small thread that still exists. And so what we're advocating for is a form of reparations, a form of accounting for everything that has been taken from the community, and to begin to restore and repair all that value that has been taken. And that value, it comes in so many forms, cultural value, private property ownership value, access to nature, access to an ecosystem such as this. All of that is value, and what we are fighting for is to oppose further takings and to propose some form of reparations.
And it would bring back a certain kind of dignity.
Right.
There you go, John.
Yeah.
Thank you, Cyrus.
Thank you,
Yeah.
everybody.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Mika.
Go team!
Are there any questions